Welcome back to Secret Weapons, and today we are taking a look at the SolidgoldFX Oblivion. I didn't know I like flangers this much. It's funny, when I think of modulation, I almost exclusively think of chorus. And what's really bizarre about that is I kind of grew up loving The Cure and the Smiths and all these bands that I attributed a ton of chorus to, but I also really loved kind of the disassociated idea of 80s guitar tone, especially clean 80s guitar tones and kind of those really thick, textury rhythm guitar parts and stuff that, once again, I always thought were just chorus. And it was really interesting to be playing with the Oblivion over the last week or so and quickly realized that, oh, it was flanger. It was so many parts that I really loved and so many sounds that were really stuck in my head, and I was always trying to replicate them with different chorus pedals, were just a good flanger instead, which is funny. Enter the Oblivion, a quad flanger from Solid Gold with a ton of very close together knobs and some switches underneath it that give you a myriad of sounds. Very weird stuff, very normal stuff. If you've seen this channel a bunch, you know that I like to angle more towards subtle sounds. I like all of my effects to kind of play together nicely and to kind of serve what I'm working on, which tends to be a little more of a smoother, calmer sound. And this thing does a lot of that stuff really well. I think a lot of flangers and phasers and stuff tend to be really kind of aggro. And this is not one of those things. This can get really subtle. The middle flanging setting and the left flanging setting are incredibly subtle. They are the fewer voices, and they sit really well in a mix. They play with different waveforms well. You can really crank the speed and the range without them getting too crazy, especially if you kind of keep the regen somewhere subtle, which I love. You can also do some really weird non-subtle stuff that sounds great. For one, I got really into playing with like the self-oscillating full regen sounds, like kind of that siren-y, warbly nonsense that's almost kind of like non-musical, but one, it's really cool, and you'll hear me in a little bit stack it with some very weird pitch shifting effects. And two, maybe it's just because I've been listening to way too much 100 gecs recently, but I like stuff that basically isn't music anymore. And I feel like mixing that maxed out regen with the secret awesome sauce of this pedal, which is the degrade switch, can create some very cool textures. This degrade switch, it basically takes you to a lo-fi, fuzzy, gritty, kind of sputtery place that is just really nice. You heard it a little bit at the end of the intro thing on some of the lower note stuff that I was playing, some of the rhythm parts, but we'll also dive into it in a couple of minutes. I don't have a lot to say about this because I tend to just find a few sounds in this kind of thing that I really like, and then I can just tell if I like the pedal or not. And we also review a lot of kind of big, grandiose multi-effects where we got to talk for a long time, but you picked a single effect video, which means we're going to keep it under an hour, hopefully, unlike a lot of my videos these days. But this thing is simple, it's straightforward. It's not that simple, it's not that straightforward, but it sounds great, and it's a specific effect, which makes it simple. It's funny to have realized this week that, oh, flanging is maybe good, actually. And also a ton of those sounds that I grew up really liking were actually flanger all this time. I feel very conflicted about my perception of modulation right now, and it's all thanks to Oblivion. So Solid Gold, this is great. Let's go to the top down and let's listen to some sounds that this thing can create. Okay, here we are at our top down pedal board thing, kind of top down diagonally of a corner top down. If you've been here before, you know that we don't do the whole setting by setting run through thing. We tend to kind of try to focus on, I like to try to focus on stuff that I find inspiring about the pedal and kind of how I like those things in context, and usually we'll get a little distracted, so let's leave room for that. Before we dive into the Oblivion, let's talk about the context of the board. We have the 29 Pedals EUNA buffer, the preamp Mark II by Chase Bliss and Benson, which is not currently engaged. We might use it at some point, but I'm not sure yet. We have the Oblivion, then we have the Hologram Electronics Microcosm, the Empress Echosystem, the Mercury 7 by Maris, and the Strymon Iridium. We are running in mono for the guitar rig, despite the fact that the second half of that are all in stereo. We're summing to mono at the end of the chain. And then in Luna, which is what the DAW that we're using right now, we are using a 1073 preamp and an LA2A compressor, maybe another compressor. We'll see. Here's our dry tone. So first things first, one of the first things I was really struck with about this is, and I think I said this earlier, I think that when I was younger, I confused 80s flanging tones with a lot of 80s chorus tones, because when I started writing the intro piece for this, that kind of bouncy, I was struck by how much it reminded me of the like 80s, I thought chorus sounds that I kind of really loved early on. Then I realized all that stuff was probably flange. We talked about this earlier. I don't know why I'm rehashing this, but this sound right here kind of feels like a quintessential throwback sound in a way that I really love. I find it's really good on those kind of two-hand tappy kind of sounds. So the kind of the kind of sweeping energy does a good job of replacing the pick attack for dynamics and for interesting texture and stuff. Which I find really cool. I also like these settings because you can kind of go anywhere you want with these and not have it be too dramatic. This is a very subtle version. See, now we're really getting into that kind of what I thought was chorus sounds. Oh, what I also really like about this is I find that this plays really well with a little more drive ahead of it for some kind of really interesting texture. So let's kick on the Automatone, the Preamp Mark II, and put a little bit of gain in front of it. It's pretty killer. Turning that preamp back off. Let's go to one of these other waveforms. Tap in a slower rhythm, and then let's take it really slow. It's interesting to hear those kind of time warps almost happen. I find that on that flange switch, those first two settings are great for kind of like subtle. And then a little more aggressive, a little more of that 80s thing, that little more of the less subtle thing. This third setting, it's a little choppy for my taste. Let's crank up that mix so you can really... I take it back. I haven't stumbled across that before. I quite like that sound. I find that I play a lot more chords with a flanger. I don't play a ton of like... That stuff I like less with this third mode. That stuff I'm a little more... That stuff's better with these first two modes. that third mode, it's really good for some chording. If you've been here before, you know I tend to like subtle effects. So you'll very rarely see me take these guys past noon on anything. But, oh, I remember. So on this third switch right here, when you crank that regen, that's where it starts to get really... There's that lack of subtlety we were talking about. But with some of these simpler settings, you can start to hear some of that self-generative noise happening. Not sure what we're doing here. I'm gonna have to gain this up like crazy in post because it's very quiet. Pull that regen back slightly because we're about to try to actually give some sound. Okay, now we're onto something. Okay, I stumbled onto something, and we're gonna play with it a little bit. We've got the microcosm set up to do some really crazy mosaic stuff, and the Empress Echosystem doing some octave up and octave down reverse delays into the Mercury 7. So let's see what that sounds like when you do almost no input guitar signal, but really crank that regen so that you can hear it right now. You can hear that kind of crazy stuff happening in the background. So let's give the guitar some actual input and see what comes of it. And that lo-fi, I think it's the degrade. Okay, so listen to that texture difference right there. So, oh, let's not turn that off. So the degrade knob turned off. And that texture brought back in. I feel like we're losing track of what we're doing here. I do like that though. Once again, this texture thing, it's just, or the degrade thing is just instant like vibe. It's just. Let's get back to a tape delay. So yeah, there's a lot of cool sounds in this thing. It's dope. It's got some very out there. I love playing with this regen control and just desperately trying to make sure that it doesn't like run away. I think that what I would do is throw a compressor behind it, like a really hard limiter compressor, so that you can't kill it, and then use that to kind of trigger weird textures in other pedals. I think it's just a very fun, especially some of these waveforms. This third position waveform is great for that runaway stuff. Stuff like that doesn't seem subtle can end up being really subtle, which I dig. So Solid Gold, you guys killed it on this thing. I I love when effects that I don't expect to use a ton really kind of like hook into my brain the way that the Oblivion has over the last week. And it's very fun. It's very cool. So yeah, that's about all we got to say on the matter. So let's just kind of leave on a little bit of a jam.